Maple Ridge was renowned for its peaceful residential areas and small-town atmosphere. It was the type of town, surrounded by farms and fields, where everyone knew one another and change didn't happen very often. Father of 40 years and assiduous accountant David Maxwell had always felt at ease here. He placed a high emphasis on stability, which was the cornerstone of his existence. His 36-year-old wife, Laura, felt the same way up until a few months ago when she decided to take a job at the local real estate company. On the surface, they appeared to be the ideal family, with their 2 kids, Sam, 7, and Anna, 10. However, despite their outward appearance, David had felt a slip. Their marriage, which had once been bursting with laughter and shared dreams, now seemed more like a ritual they went through to keep their kids safe. There was an eerie quiet that got louder every day instead of battles or dramatic situations. David frequently wondered if other couples shared his feelings, or if he was the only one who missed their previous level of intimacy. A turning point had occurred with Laura's new work. She told him stories about her coworkers when she got home. Most of them were pals he had never heard of. Even though he made an effort to exhibit attention, he couldn't get rid of the sensation that he was seeing her new life from the outside. She had always been the quiet, homebody spouse in their 12th year of marriage, but the work had sparked an independence in her that occasionally made David feel like an outsider. David unexpectedly ran into someone on a Friday night when he went to the neighborhood liquor store to get a bottle of wine for their scheduled movie night. "David? Would that be you, David Maxwell?" David heard a voice he recognized calling out to him. David turned and saw Mike, a friend from high school that he hadn't seen in ages. Shaking hands quickly, they were both taken aback by their coincidental meeting. David saw the changes in his friend, a hint of a paunch, more gray around the temples. However, Mike's contagious smile remained unchanged. For a little while, they laughed together over old jokes and memories of the good old days. The topic eventually shifted to their current lifestyles. "How is Laura doing now?" "I heard she started working with my wife," Rachel Mike said casually. David smiled and nodded, commenting on how well she had adapted. Then, Mike asked, "You didn't go to the company Christmas party, huh?" David paused, taken aback. "No, I wasn't invited," he said, masking his surprise. Laura had mentioned a party, but she'd explained it was a small, employees-only event. Rachel said it was a full family affair. They invited all the spouses. "Laura didn't tell you?" The question lingered in the air, triggering a sense of unease in David. He brushed it off with a casual laugh. Yet the moment felt heavy, like the first crack in a frozen lake. The conversation continued, but his thoughts drifted. As he walked home, wine bottle in hand, a question gnawed him. Why would Laura lie about something so simple? Back at home, he found Laura in the kitchen, immersed in meal preparation. She greeted him warmly, but David couldn't shake the weight of Mike's revelation. He tried to act naturally, making small talk with the children and lending a hand with dinner, yet his mind was elsewhere, running through details from the past few months, piecing together fragments he hadn't paid much attention to before. Later that night, as Laura sat across from him, laughing at a scene from the movie, David felt a pang of nostalgia. They hadn't shared this lightheartedness in what felt like ages. But now, that familiar warmth was tainted with a tinge of doubt. Why hadn't she invited him to the party? It seemed trivial on the surface, yet it felt like the beginning of something larger, something he couldn't yet name but felt compelled to uncover. The seed of doubt took root and grew in David's mind over the following days, impossible to ignore. Every glance at Laura seemed to unearth more questions. He watched her now with an intensity he hadn't before, noting every detail, the new perfume she wore, the way she checked her phone in quick, furtive glances, and how her laugh had changed, sounding softer, almost practiced. One evening, unable to keep his thoughts to himself any longer, David decided to ask about the Christmas party. Trying to keep his tone casual, he asked as they cleared the dinner table, "Hey, so about that work Christmas party? Mike mentioned that everyone's spouse was invited. I thought you said it was employees only." Laura's expression froze, her hand lingering on a plate, and he saw something flicker across her face. He couldn't exactly place it because it happened so quickly. But it left a strange impression. She forced a grin as she immediately collected herself. "Hoa that?" Her tone was a touch too light as she said, "Must have been a misunderstanding on my part." She rehearsed her answer. David nodded, his stomach churning, seeming to listen to her justification. All the information he needed was conveyed by the tiny strain in her shoulders and the way her gaze moved. This was not an easy miscommunication. In the days that followed, David was overcome with a feeling of loneliness. The Laura he believed he knew suddenly appeared unfamiliar, as though her ideas and deeds were hidden behind a door that he was unable to open. She had grown more aloof, often staying late at work after meetings and traveling on the weekends for training. He could not get beyond the wall of excuses that piled on top of one another. David was sitting in his study one evening when he received an unexpected call on the house phone from a number he was unfamiliar with. He picked up when he paused. Stillness welcomed him. Not a response. The conversation ended as quickly as it had started, leaving him confused and looking at the receiver. Laura's response when he attempted to lighten the situation later on was very different from what he had anticipated. Her eyes widened and her face tensed as she stammered. Perhaps a practical joke and nothing to be alarmed about. However, he had never seen such anxiety or uneasiness in her. That one instant added a new piece to the jigsaw. One more hint that raised his doubts. David started observing Laura carefully and seeing patterns in her behavior that he had previously overlooked, driven by a need to comprehend what was going on. She used to be timely and mindful of her time, but these days her schedule was unpredictable, punctuated by extended periods during which she appeared to be distracted. She gave him evasive responses and phony promises when he inquired about whether she would be arriving home late. As the days stretched into weeks, David had a sense of unease, his mind muddled by mistrust and a resentment he could not quite control. He was driven by desperation to discover evidence, anything tangible to support or refute the negative notions that had taken hold of him. After closely observing Laura's online activity, he finally made the decision to do something he had never thought of before, monitoring her internet usage. One evening, David entered their shared home computer while Laura was working late outside the house, setting up an application to replicate her actions. He couldn't shake the uneasy, intrusive sensation that had taken up residence in his chest. After a few days, he found an email account with the name Bright Sunset that he had never seen before. Every email was like a fresh piece of information, and each line showed how the marriage he thought he knew was slowly falling apart. He looked at one contact in particular. Contented Voyager. Laura and this unidentified correspondent began exchanging communications that were conversational in nature, talking about everyday subjects. But shortly after, he started to sense a deeper closeness, the type that suggested whispers and secrets exchanged. With each communication, he felt more and more like an outsider as it alluded to inside jokes and allusions he was unable to comprehend. David was determined to learn more, so he looked into it, and found that happy traveler was actually Chris, a salesperson Laura worked with. A location where business travel was common. Recollections of Laura's giggles over business meals streamed back to him, all of them tinged with distrust, which strengthened his resolve. He had to take action or let this falsehood continue. David started to think of a strategy since he felt both betrayed and angry. He was going to face Chris head-on and break the cycle of silence that had taken over his life. However, he was in need of concrete proof that would reveal Laura's true intentions. He made a call to a private investigator, but he felt concerned about paying someone else to snoop on his wife. He made the decision to take issues into his own hands and manage it himself. David noticed that he was eyeing Laura more intently as he waited for his chance. Every chuckle or missing grin appeared to have a deeper significance each time she picked up her phone. And then, at last, the opportunity he had been waiting for came. Laura casually said that she would be attending a work function on the same day that Chris had scheduled a business trip to a nearby city. That was sufficient confirmation for him. David took a car to the location he had discovered in relation to Chris's leased flat later that night. He slyly parked his car down the street, feeling a mixture of dread and eagerness in his heartbeat. Observing from his elevated position, he sensed an increase in heart rate upon witnessing Laura's vehicle arrive at the flat. She looked around as if to make sure she was at the right place before going in. David's heart stopped when he saw her disappear through the door. David couldn't control himself and called her, thinking she would convince him differently. Her voice was calm as she spoke, concealing any emotions that could have been there. David, hello. Just myself at the gathering. I'll give you a call later because it's a little loud here. Are you sure? You're at an event. Laura, he said, clenching his hands and quivering his voice. For I think I just witnessed you entering Chris's apartment. She spoke after a startled quiet of a time, her voice faltering. What are you talking about? David? What you're thinking is real. But David was aware of what he had observed. His hands became tighter around the phone as the realization of her treachery weighed hard on him. Angry feelings filled his senses as he hung up, sapping the last bit of his remaining patience. With his head filled with anger and hurt, he raced toward the apartment, prepared to face Chris and put an end to the act. David's rage drove him onward, a tornado of hurt and betrayal driving him with every step toward Chris's apartment. As he approached the door, his hands trembled, and he could no longer focus on anything other than Laura's lies and justifications for them. He banged on the door instead of knocking. He heard muffled voices within, and his heart began to race. Chris was surprised to see David standing there as the door suddenly opened. David cut him off before he could respond. He barged in and looked around the room before settling on Laura. With a pale face and big eyes filled with remorse and terror, she remained still in awe. "What is this?" With a shaky voice filled with anger, David demanded. "You have been deceiving me for some months now. Were you simply waiting for me to discover the truth?" Laura's mouth opened, but no words came out. Chris stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, but David's patience had reached its limit. "Stay out of this, Chris," he spat, his gaze fixed on his wife. "I want to hear it from her." Laura took a shaky breath, looking away as she murmured, "It's not what you think, David. It's complicated." "Complicated?" David echoed bitterly. "You've lied to me, betrayed our family, and I find you in this man's apartment, and you're calling it complicated?" His voice rose with each word, the rage within him burning hotter than he could contain. Chris attempted to intervene again. "David, listen." But David's control snapped. In a blur of emotion, he lunged forward, pushing Chris backward. Furniture toppled, a lamp shattered, the room filled with the sounds of their scuffle. Laura screamed, stepping between them as she pleaded, "David, stop. This isn't solving anything." But David couldn't hear her. All he could see was betrayal, the destruction of the life he had built. He grabbed Chris by the collar, shouting, "You had no right. No right to come between us." Laura's voice finally broke through the haze. "David, please. I'll explain everything, but not like this." Her eyes filled with tears, her voice a mix of panic and desperation. For an instant, David saw the lady he had loved and married. But the treachery ingrained in his mind was too strong even for that image to cover up. David stepped back, panting fiercely, as his hold on Chris relaxed. The flat was a literal representation of the turmoil he felt within, with broken glass and overturned furniture. Taking one final glance at Laura, he was filled with emptiness and raw, unprotected anguish from her treachery. "You've ruined everything," he murmured softly, the anger in his voice gone from a minute before. "Was all we created worth it?" Laura could only stand there silently, tears running down her cheeks. Data did not await a response. He turned and left Laura and Chris in the wreckage of their own creating, slamming the door behind him. The weight of the conflicts weighed on him as he made his way back to his car. His heart was broken. His mind was filled with questions that would never have a solution, and he felt like a man split in two. Even worse reality awaited him when he got home. By calling her parents to come get Anna and Sam, Laura had cut him off from the one constant in his life, his kids. David sat by himself in their dimly lit living room that evening, the stillness weighing heavily on him. His children crossed his mind. Of the family that they had been, and experienced a void where his trust had been. For the first time, he didn't know whether he would ever be able to put the life he had created back together. It was falling apart. Following David's encounter with Chris and Laura, things swiftly got out of control, entangling him in a web of legal issues and psychological ruin. Chris filed accusations of assault and property damage against David within a few days. The local police paid David a visit and interrogated him about what had happened at Chris's flat, going over every detail and demanding an answer. Though his lawyer advised him to downplay the incident as self-defense in order to lessen the repercussions, he was very ashamed of what had happened. The impact was as severe for Laura. She started to formalize custody arrangements while trying to deal with her own shock and guilt, trying to protect their kids from the untidy reality that is erupting all around them. Unable to let go of the two constants in his life, Sam and Anna, David resisted her choice, but the friction between them only helped to build a deeper wedge. David made things much more complicated by taking strong measures to safeguard his finances. Wanting to have some control over their joint resources, he moved money and emptied their common accounts so Laura wouldn't have access. However, his action backfired, inflaming Laura's rage and escalating the custody and asset dispute in court. David felt encircled and ensnared in an endless legal battle after she engaged a different lawyer to aggressively represent her interests. In the midst of the confusion, David managed to get back in touch with his secretary, Emma. At first, they grew close over work-related issues and light banter, but Emma became consoling when he revealed the details of his unhappy marriage. She had gone through the sorrow of divorce herself due to infidelity. Over the course of their lengthy talks, which continued deep into the night, their relationship became closer and closer. David found comfort in Emma's empathy and patience, which stood in stark contrast to the painful relics of his marriage. David began spending more time with Emma as their relationship grew, withdrawing into the comfort of her company. She reminded him that life could go on despite the wounds caused by treachery, providing him with a haven from the chaos. After some time, David and Emma decided to take a chance and carefully start a new relationship based on trust and understanding. They both found comfort in each other's company. However, the reminders of David's past persisted even as he welcomed this new phase. He was unable to get rid of the memories of the family that had previously defined him and the life he had lost. He had a tense connection with Sam and Anna. exacerbated by the court disputes and the psychological damage of his breakup with Laura. In calmer times, he pondered whether he would ever be able to achieve the stability he so desperately desired and whether treachery eventually came with an irreversible damage. With every stride he moved ahead, the crack in his heart appeared to become wider. He had heard from common acquaintances that Laura and Chris were trying to build a relationship of their own, but there was a lot of friction between them. Nobody, least of all David, missed the comedy of their tense relationship, yet it satisfied him little. Despite everything, he knew that his family was gone, and no new connection could ever make up for it. This left him feeling empty. David hadn't prepared for the finality of receiving divorce papers in his mailbox, but it was a moment he had expected. It felt like a formal admission of all he had lost, a promise broken, a chapter finished, to sign them. As per the arrangement, Laura was given primary custody of Sam and Anna, but David was allowed to see them. They had both been emotionally and physically exhausted from the legal fights, and ultimately, neither of them had the stamina to continue fighting. David and Laura got together one day to talk about the kids' schedules. Tension and unsaid words filled the air between them, their recollections of happier times tainting the stillness. Laura gave him a glance as they went over the specifics at one point. "I never meant for all of this to happen, David," she muttered as her countenance softened. "I had no intention of leaving you." Her voice trailed off, leaving the words unspoken. David looked at her, feeling a complicated mix of acceptance, grief, and rage. "Laura, even though you may not have meant to, you did. In every manner that mattered, you were gone. There's nothing left now." The sense of finality and inevitability that had hovered over them for months was reflected in the grief in his voice. Laura and Chris signed the papers, split their possessions, and tried to start their separate life. However, David learned from acquaintances that their relationship was turbulent, full of fights and remorse. David was not satisfied with this, though. It served as a simple reminder of the betrayed trust and the decisions that brought them all to this point. Together, David and Emma took a step forward and began to construct a new foundation. Their lives gradually merged. As they established mutual respect, common routines, and comforts that made their house seem stable in a manner David hadn't felt in years. Emma's arrival turned into a balm, numbing the sharp edges of his loss. Together, they made a commitment to creating something fresh, a life characterized by understanding and optimism rather than by betrayal or regret. His bond with Sam and Anna turned become his compass. He tried his hardest to regain the trust that had been lost throughout the turmoil, despite their initial tension. He made time for every school function and weekend visit, gently repairing the relationship with each joke and exchange of words. Gradually, they ceased to perceive him as the parent swept away by the waves of strife, and instead saw him as their steadfast pillar of support. David will remember this period of his life as one of difficult development years later, encouraging him to reflect on his values and life goals. He still wondered about forgiveness, hadn't made up his mind about it, but wasn't in a hurry to decide. Realizing that some solutions weren't intended to be simple, and that life may still have purpose even in the wake of tragedy, brought him serenity. One tranquil evening, David and Emma stood in the yard watching his kids play, their laughter filling the air. Ultimately, he understood that he had discovered a fresh start, a new beginning that enabled him to get over the hurt. Even while the scars persisted, he no longer considered them to be wounds, but rather as symbols of the path that had brought him to this point, a life restored through perseverance, trust, and the belief in second chances.